Stats SA released its latest survey report last week, and in it, it showed that the unemployment rate reached a 5-year high with more than 9.6 million South Africans without a job. The young people are on the front line of the crisis as 2/3 of young people between the ages of 15 and 24 are jobless. To unpack this story further, I'm joined now on the line by the Chief Economist for Econometrics, Dr. Azar Jammine. Azar, welcome to the show and thanks for joining us one more time.
Good evening to you and good evening to your viewers.
We've had a slew of not so encouraging economic news since the beginning of the year, and this is just one more, this time the unemployment report. Why is our unemployment so persistently stubborn?
It's quite straightforward to explain, and it's a function of the high level of poor education in amongst such a large section of our younger population. That's the first thing. And that means that so many of these youngsters are just not sufficiently qualified to add value to the economy. And that doesn't mean only in terms of intellectual value, it also means in terms of artisanal value. You know, there's so many opportunities for decent plumbers and electricians and builders, but the youngsters are not actually developing those skills and instead trying to do other stuff that where there isn't really such a big demand. And the second big reason is the adversarial labor relations between business and labor. Yes, it's a function of the high levels of inequality in the country, but it does lead to a situation where business just has very little incentive to take on people on a full-time basis for fear of toying and for fear of excessive demands and because they feel that they have to pay those workers more than they get from them from a point of view of productivity. And then within the unions themselves, there is a severe reluctance on the part of many of these unions to see opportunities given to younger people to get jobs because the union members, who are traditionally a little older, fear that they will lose their jobs if the youngsters are given preference and incentives to do so.
Going back to your point about the skills levels or lack thereof broadly in the younger population in South Africa. Now, that is a very difficult thing to address, isn't it? If we look at it, just a second, sorry to interrupt you there,
Sure.
On two levels. So one, as we move forward in terms of economic development, and I'm talking about globally, we're moving further and further into a technology-driven future. What is commonly spoken about or addressed as the fourth industrial revolution. It requires high levels of skills for that progression to happen, and it's inevitable that it's going to happen. Everything is becoming more and more digital. And on the other end of the spectrum is the sorts of skills that you're talking about, plumbers, electricians, et cetera, and there's still a lot of scope for those types of jobs within the economy. Now, when you look at those two broad categories of skills, how do we address those in the short term? Because firstly, on the high end of the technology skills, I find it hard to believe that we can address those in the short term. It's probably a long-term effort. But how do we do it at the artisanal level?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I think on both levels it takes time, and that is one of the big challenges. And there's a huge impatience in South Africa for people to be employed without realizing that it takes a long supply chain of activities. It's actually starting from pre-primary level. That's where we really need to start teaching children how to read and write. Their gogos need to be involved in that. And that hasn't been happening the way it should and the way it used to happen in the old days. The second point to make is that at the artisanal level, you really need to improve the level of our TVET colleges that are supposed to specialize in that. But there is another issue, and that's more a psychological one, where young South Africans, and of all races, by the way, seem to be reluctant to go into those kind of fields because they look down upon them. It's below their social stratus, and that's very, very sad to see. I mean, and as for the highly skilled levels, well, the really big shortage is decent maths and science teaching. Yeah. And we know that there's huge impediments being put in place of the Department of Education in attempts to try and improve science education. The teachers' unions really don't make it a particularly easy task.
And all of this, of course, translates into a particular economic picture, if you will. Obviously, lack of skills has an impact on economic growth, and economic growth also has an impact on unemployment, which is exacerbated by the lack of skills. So when we talk about driving growth more generally for South Africa, if we're going to put together a plan to drive growth beyond just stabilizing it at around the 2% mark, driving it to somewhere around the 4, 5, 6, 7%. How do we do that? Because ultimately that's what we need to do.
You actually have to tackle all these issues head on. And unfortunately, the type of announcement made last Tuesday by President Ramaphosa is not very helpful in this regard because there was very little detail. You've got to get to the bottom of the educational problems. You've got to get to the bottom of trying to improve labor relations between workers and executives, and it comes from both sides. The executives also have to be prepared to give a little and not to be too greedy themselves in order to try and improve those labor relations. And there actually are many other aspects as well that I haven't mentioned that are also quite important. There's far too much power, economic power, concentrated in the hands of the state-owned enterprises and big businesses in South Africa, far too little small business activity where employment could really thrive. And that's a historical legacy of apartheid because money and sanctions, where money was bottled in the hands of large financial institutions who just bought up shares in other large companies. But we've got to get out of that. Finally, of course, just too much regulation is not helping the situation either. And many of these issues are all interrelated. The one affects the other in this way and the other one in another way, but actually it's a circular process. And unless you actually embark upon a comprehensive strategy and, don't take prisoners, you don't take excuses, and you just go hell for leather in a certain direction, you're not going to make much progress.
Azar, just one perspective from me on what you just said now. You mentioned the announcement last week. Now, that's in relation to land expropriation. We also have some other pending issues that are as impactful, whether negatively or positively, such as national health insurance, as an example. In the telecommunications industry, there's a whole wireless open access network which is supposed to pool all frequencies into one single network so that the operators don't get their own frequencies individually. And that has stymied the development of the industry to some extent because, frequency is the lifeblood of telecoms. And as we move towards 5G, you must have the frequencies. You could maybe get by with 4G, but you can't do it at 5G level. You need the frequencies. Now, those are just 3 examples of mega issues, what I would regard as mega issues that need some resolution in some way or other. When you look at a picture like that, those 3 issues, and probably a few others we could mention, and the risk inherent in them, does that concern you?
Of course it concerns me because they seem to be insurmountable, and yet with proper thought and proper research process in each of those, and people actually doing things for the right thing, for the right reason, and not just for political objectives, I think we could go very, very far in resolving them. The land expropriation problem, for example, could be unraveled in a way that provides massive economic opportunities rather than being seen by so many people as a disincentive for investment. But we then need to start considering the distribution of title deeds to the majority of the population so that they can start using that piece of paper as a source of wealth and as a security against which to borrow money. In the national health insurance thing, you're absolutely correct when only 17% of the population has access to medical aids, and it's only those who are involved in formal sector employment. So the moment that you start improving employment, you'll get more and more people getting onto medical aids. But also, one needs to get away from this idea that that is the first objective without actually addressing the poor service delivery within the current public health system. And so you go on. I'm not an expert on the telecommunications field, but then we need to do a lot of strategic thinking and give people a 5- and 10-year plan of action that makes a lot of sense, and try and persuade people to be patient enough to wait to see the benefits. Unfortunately, politics seems to reign supreme, and next year's elections are foremost in so many people's minds, and so we don't get the appropriate long-term vision that is really required.
I'd like to talk to you about a couple of SMME reports as well that came out last week. But before that, just on the point you made about planning and forward planning, are you surprised? Well, I am. I have to put it to you. I am surprised that in discussions that I've had with stakeholders in the mining industry, labor, government, etc., there doesn't seem to be a specific blueprint for what I consider to be 3 critical sectors of the mining industry, that being coal, gold, and platinum. Does it surprise you that there's no blueprint for each one of these sectors?
No, it doesn't, because the inability to get a blueprint for these industries it basically encroaches upon some of the issues that I've addressed, namely the inability to get a decent relationship between workers and employers. I mean, we see in so many world comparative indices, South Africa is one of the worst in terms of industrial relations. And secondly, we need to start focusing on getting the job done rather than concentrating on politicking all the time about, numbers involved in transformation, etc. Yes, a lot needs to be done from a transformational point of view, but I think we have failed dismally with the transformation initiatives that have already been put into place, and clearly it's not working. We need to look for another kind of solution.
Just finally, Azar, the 2 reports came out on SMMEs last week, and just put it, in a nutshell, they essentially are saying that there's only about 250,000 formal SMMEs in South Africa, a lot less than previously thought, as in the belief previously was that there were in excess of 2 million of these companies. Now they're saying 250,000. Not only that, they're only responsible for around 30% of the jobs. That's a bit frightening, isn't it? And sorry, just one last thing, and also the profitability of these companies is declining. There are fewer and fewer of them being registered, and more of them going out of business.
You're absolutely correct, and I'm so glad that these reports are finally coming to the fore, because that is one of the big fault lines of the economy. And I mentioned it earlier, there is far too much concentration of power in the hands of a few large organizations. And in many ways, it suits the politicians for that to be the case, because it's so much more easier to control the economy if there are just a handful of players, be they in the private sector or the public sector. But that is not conducive to job creation. And one only needs to look around at the success stories that have been seen around the world, including China, to see how small business has been at the heart of the success that such economies have achieved.
Azar, thank you very much once again for joining us, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Pleasure.